Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. This video provides a historical and educational deep dive into the intersection of early American cinema and the evolution of retirement assets, specifically the legal framework surrounding the 401k during marital dissolution. The information presented here is for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute professional legal, financial, or investment advice. Laws regarding qualified domestic relations orders and community property vary significantly by state and are subject to change. Always consult with a qualified attorney or a certified financial planner regarding your specific situation before making any decisions. Conduct your own due diligence. Imagine a world where the flicker of a silent film projector and the fine print of a retirement account statement are two sides of the same American coin. Now, in the United States, there is a silent crisis brewing in the family courts that most people do not see coming until it is far too late. It is a phenomenon where decades of hard-earned compound interest, the very foundation of your future security, can be halved or decimated in a single afternoon. But to understand why our modern financial system treats your 401k the way it does during a divorce, we have to look back at a time before television, before the internet, and long before the Revenue Act of 1978. We have to look at the birth of the American dream on the silver screen, and how the early titans of cinema shaped our concepts of marital property and individual success. In this masterclass, we are peeling back the curtain on a connection you've never been told exists. We are exploring the high-stakes evolution of early U.S. cinema, and how the culture of Hollywood's golden age inadvertently set the stage for the modern 401k divorce. Most Americans believe their retirement account is a private fortress, a personal reward for years of labor. The reality is that historical trends and legislative shifts have transformed these accounts into communal pots that are more vulnerable than you might think. By the end of this series, you will understand the historical gravity of the QDRO, the cinematic roots of our financial expectations, and the exact step-by-step evolution of how the company man of the 1920s became the 401k litigant of the 2020s. This is the ultimate guide to understanding the history and the modern reality of your most valuable paper assets. To set the stage, we must look at the early 1900s. Cinema wasn't just entertainment. It was the primary engine of American social engineering. In the era of silent films, actors like Mary Pickford and Charlie Chaplin weren't just celebrities. They were the first examples of massive individual wealth accumulation in the public eye. Before this, wealth was largely tied to land or family-owned industry. The rise of the star system introduced the concept of the high-earning individual, whose value was tied to a contract. This is the direct ancestor of the modern high-earning professional with a 401k. When we look at the divorce of Mary Pickford and Owen Moore in 1920, we see the very first ripples of what we now call asset division. Back then, there was no such thing as a 401k, but there were studio contracts and future earnings potential. The legal battles of early Hollywood stars forced the U.S. court system to grapple with a difficult question. If one spouse becomes a millionaire while the other provides the domestic stability to allow that career to flourish, who owns the value of that career? This question is the exact same one asked in 401k mediation today. When a spouse claims a portion of a 401k, they aren't just asking for cash. They are claiming a stake in the time and labor invested during the years of the marriage. To understand the 401k specifically, we have to fast forward through the cinematic transition to talkies and the subsequent rise of the corporate pension. For much of the 20th century, the defined benefit plan was king. You worked for a company for 30 years, and they gave you a gold watch and a guaranteed check every month until you died. In a divorce scenario, these were relatively easy to value, you just calculated the monthly payout. However, as the 1970s approached, the American economic landscape shifted. The film industry was moving away from the big studio model toward independent productions, and the workforce was moving away from the lifetime pension model toward defined contribution plans. The 401k, birthed from Section 401k of the Internal Revenue Code in 1978, was never intended to be the primary retirement vehicle for the entire U.S. population. It was a tax loophole for executives that went viral, but as it became the standard, it created a massive pool of liquid adjacent wealth that didn't exist for the average worker in the 1940s or 50s. This shift changed the math of divorce forever. Suddenly, the most significant asset in a household wasn't always the family home. It was the 401k balance. Let's look at a case study from the mid-1980s, shortly after the 401k became mainstream. In early cinema, the vamp or the hero were archetypes that influenced how the public viewed morality and fairness. By the 80s, these archetypes shifted into the corporate climber. When a marriage dissolved in this era, the courts had to figure out how to split a 401k without triggering massive tax penalties from the IRS. This led to the creation of the Qualified Domestic Relations Order, or QDRO. The QDRO is the most powerful document you've likely never heard of. It is a legal instruction that tells a plan administrator to carve out a piece of one person's retirement account and give it to another person. Without it, you cannot move 401k funds between ex-spouses without the IRS treating it as a standard withdrawal, hitting you with a 10% early withdrawal penalty and standard income tax. The complexity of the QDRO mirrors the complexity of the old Hollywood studio contracts, full of clauses, vesting schedules, and specific language that can make or break a person's financial future. Historical trends show us that as the U.S. moved further away from the community-centric model of the early 20th century and toward the hyper-individualized model of the late 20th century, the ownership of retirement assets became a primary point of contention. In the silent film era, a divorce was often a matter of social scandal. Today, a 401k divorce is a matter of mathematical precision. For example, if a worker contributes $10,000 a year to a 401k over a 10-year marriage, and the market grows at an average of 7%, the balance is roughly $138,000. If that marriage ends, the marital portion is generally considered the contributions and growth that occurred between the wedding date and the date of separation. But here is where the cinema-style drama enters the financial world. What happens if the account was started 5 years before the wedding? The tracing of these assets requires a forensic level of detail. You have to separate the separate property, what you had before the marriage, from the marital property, what was earned during. If you don't have the statements from 10 or 20 years ago, the court might default to assuming the whole thing is marital property. This is why historical record-keeping is just as important for your finances as it is for film preservationists trying to save lost reels of 1920s nitrate film. We are currently living in an era where the average age of divorce is rising, particularly gray divorce among those over 50. For this demographic, the 401k isn't just a number. It is the difference between a comfortable retirement and having to work indefinitely. The stakes have never been higher. The cinematic ideals of the mid-century, happily ever after, have met the cold, hard reality of modern statutory law. As we dive deeper into this 10-part series, we will examine the specific tax implications of splitting these assets, the role of vesting, the financial equivalent of a star's option in a contract, and how to navigate the logistical nightmare of the QDRO process. We are moving from the glitz of the red carpet to the grit of the balance sheet, because understanding where we came from is the only way to protect where you are going. To truly grasp how a 401k becomes a battlefield in a 2026 divorce, we have to look at the architectural shift in American labor that mirrored the shift from silent films to the studio system powerhouse. In the early 1920s, the concept of a retirement fund was virtually non-existent for the average American. You worked until you couldn't, and then you relied on family. But the film industry was the first to commoditize human talent on a massive long-term scale. Think about the contract of a star like Charlie Chaplin. In 1917, he signed a contract for $1 million. This was an astronomical sum, but it represented a shift in how wealth was viewed. It wasn't just cash. It was a vested interest in future performance and intellectual property. In the modern era, your 401k is your personal $1 million contract. It is a vested interest in the future growth of the American economy. When we talk about the 401k divorce, we are essentially talking about the dissolution of a multi-year production. Imagine a couple in 2026. Let's call them Sarah and Mark. Mark has been a software engineer for 15 years, contributing diligently to his 401k. Sarah has managed the household and worked part-time, allowing Mark to focus on the high-intensity sprints required to earn those corporate matching contributions. In the eyes of the law in many U.S. jurisdictions, that 401k is not just Mark's account. It is a joint production, much like a film co-produced by two different entities. The historical trend that led us here began with the Revenue Act of 1978, but the mindset was forged much earlier. During the golden age of Hollywood, the studios owned the actors. The studios provided the security, the branding, and the retirement, often in the form of informal pensions or continued work. When the studio system collapsed due to antitrust rulings in the late 1940s, the individual became responsible for their own brand and their own future. This is the exact same transition the American worker made when the traditional pension was phased out in favor of the 401k. The burden of risk shifted from the employer to the employee. When that risk-bearing employee gets divorced in 2026, the court looks at the 401k through the lens of marital effort. Case studies in family law often highlight a concept known as the coverture fraction. This is a mathematical formula used to determine what portion of a retirement plan is considered marital property. It is calculated by taking the number of months the individual was both married and participating in the plan, and dividing it by the total number of months the individual participated in the plan. Imagine Mark started his 401k in 2010. He got married to Sarah in 2016. They are now filing for divorce in 2026. Mark has 16 years of total participation in the plan, which is 192 months. They were married for 10 of those years, or 120 months. The marital portion of that 401k is 120 divided by 192, which is approximately 62.5%. Even if the account currently holds $500,000, Sarah may be entitled to 50% of that 62.5% portion. This isn't just about splitting a bank account. It is about forensic accounting that stretches back decades. This brings us back to the cinematic connection. In the early days of film, the division of assets was often handled through ironclad, often predatory, prenuptial agreements, or through the sheer power of the studios to suppress scandal and financial loss. Today, the 401k is governed by ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. This federal law is the script that every 401k divorce must follow. ERISA is designed to protect plan participants, but it also creates the framework for the QDRO. The QDRO, or Qualified Domestic Relations Order, acts as a legal bridge. Without it, if Mark were to simply withdraw $150,000 to give to Sarah as part of their settlement, the IRS would view this as a premature distribution. Mark would be hit with an immediate 10% early withdrawal penalty if he is under age 59 and a half, plus federal and state income taxes, which could eat up nearly 40 to 50% of the total amount. The QDRO allows for the tax-free transfer of these funds from Mark's account into a separate IRA or 401k in Sarah's name. It is the only way to move the money without the government taking a massive cut. However, the process of drafting a QDRO is where many people fall into a financial abyss. It is not a standard form you download from the internet. Every 401k plan administrator has different requirements. Some require specific language regarding gains and losses between the date of separation and the date of distribution. Imagine if the stock market drops by 15%, while the lawyers are arguing over the paperwork. If the QDRO is written to give Sarah a fixed dollar amount, say $150,000, Mark is the one who bears the entire 15% loss on the remaining balance. If the QDRO is written as a percentage of the account, they both share in the market volatility. This mirrors the high-stakes negotiations of early film stars who had to decide between a flat fee or a percentage of the back-end profits. Those who took the flat fee often regretted it when the film became a massive hit, while those who took the percentage risked everything if the film flopped. In a 401k divorce, you are negotiating your own back-end profits. Historical trends show that the complexity of these cases has increased as the 401k has evolved to include more diverse investment options. In the 1980s, a 401k might have been invested in a simple mutual fund. In 2026, a 401k might contain target date funds, company stock, or even specialized brokerage windows. Each of these assets reacts differently to the passage of time and the division of the account. Consider the case study of a high-net-worth individual in the modern film industry, who has both a standard 401k and a non-qualified deferred compensation plan. The tax treatment for these is entirely different. A QDRO generally only applies to qualified plans. If you try to use a QDRO for a non-qualified plan, it might be rejected, leaving the parties in a legal stalemate. This is the modern equivalent of a silent film star trying to navigate the transition to sound. The old rules no longer apply, and the new rules are unforgiving. As we move forward in this deep dive, we have to address the psychological element. Why is the 401k divorce so much more painful than other types of asset division? It is because the 401k represents the future. It is the manifestation of years of delayed gratification. In early cinema, the dream was the spotlight. In the 2026 American economy, the dream is the freedom to walk away from the spotlight and live on your own terms. When that dream is divided, it feels like a violation of the individual's timeline. But what if I told you there is a hidden trap in the way these accounts are valued that has its roots in the accounting scandals of the early 1930s? What if the number you see on your statement isn't the number the court actually uses? In the next part, we are going to expose the hidden mechanics of valuation and the specific mistakes that can cause a 401k to vanish during the negotiation process. We are going to look at the secret role of the plan administrator, the person who actually holds the power in your divorce, and why they might be your biggest obstacle. The plan administrator is the unsung director of your financial life, standing in the shadows much like the powerful studio executives of the 1930s who controlled every aspect of a star's career, from their public image to their private bank accounts. While your divorce attorney and your spouse's attorney are the lead actors on stage, the plan administrator is the one who ultimately decides if the script they have written, the QDRO, is actually going to be produced. If the language in that legal document doesn't perfectly align with the internal policies of the retirement plan, the administrator will reject it. This can lead to months of delays, increased legal fees, and a complete stall in the division of assets. In the early days of Hollywood, if a studio head like Louis B. Mayer didn't like a script, it was shelved. In 2026, if a plan administrator doesn't like your QDRO, your financial future is shelved. To understand why this happens, we have to look at the historical trends of corporate record keeping. When the 401k system was first being implemented in the late 1970s and early 1980s, these systems were built on archaic mainframe computers. The logic was rigid. As these plans grew to hold trillions of dollars, the administrative burden became massive. To manage this, corporations created highly specific, standardized plan documents. These documents are the ultimate law of the land for your retirement account, often superseding even a state court judge's intent. If a judge orders a 401k to be split in a way that the plan document does not allow, for example, by ordering an immediate cash payout when the plan only allows for transfers to another qualified account, the plan administrator is legally obligated to say no. Imagine a scenario in 2026 involving a character named David. David has been a middle manager at a major logistics firm for 20 years. His 401k is his largest asset, valued at $800,000. During his divorce from his wife, Elena, they agreed to a 50-50 split. Their lawyers draft a QDRO that states Elena should receive $400,000 plus interest from the date of the divorce filing. They submit this to the plan administrator, thinking the hard part is over. However, the administrator rejects it because the specific plan David is enrolled in does not allow for the calculation of interest on a segregated account during the processing period. It only allows for a percentage-based split of the actual gains or losses of the underlying investments. Because the lawyers use the word interest instead of earnings and losses, the document is worthless. David and Elena are now stuck in a legal loop, paying their attorneys $400 an hour to argue with a faceless compliance department. This rigidity is a direct descendant of the early cinema era's contractual strictness. When an actor was under a 7-year contract in the 1930s, every single day of their life was accounted for. If they took an unauthorized vacation, their contract was suspended and the time was added to the end. There was no room for interpretation. Similarly, the 401k plan administrator is a fiduciary, meaning they are legally required to act in the best interest of the plan as a whole, not the individual participants. This means they will always prioritize their own internal compliance rules over the desires of a divorcing couple. Now, let's talk about the hidden trap of valuation that dates back to the accounting shifts of the 1930s. In the early days of film, the value of a movie was often recorded at its production cost. It wasn't until later that the industry realized the true value lay in the residuals and future broadcast rights. In a 401k divorce in 2026, most people look at the balance on their phone screen and assume that is the value. But there is a massive difference between the account balance and the actuarial value, especially if there are outstanding 401k loans. If David had taken a $50,000 loan from his 401k to renovate the kitchen 2 years before the divorce, that loan is technically an asset of the plan. However, it is also a liability for David. If the divorce settlement says Elena gets half of the $400,000 account, does she get half of the $350,000 in cash plus half of the $50,000 debt? Or does the court treat the $50,000 loan as part of David's share? If David loses his job during the divorce, that loan is immediately treated as a distribution by the IRS, triggering taxes and penalties. This is the financial equivalent of a film production going over budget and the studio pulling the plug mid-shoot. The expected profit evaporates, leaving only debt and litigation. Historical trends in U.S. family law show that the treatment of these loans varies wildly from state to state. In some community property states, the loan is considered a marital debt, while in others, it is considered the sole responsibility of the person who took it out. This brings us to the concept of the valuation date. In early cinema, the value of a star could plummet overnight due to a single scandal. In a 401k divorce, the value of the account can shift by tens of thousands of dollars between the date of filing and the date the QDRO is finally processed. Case studies from the market volatility of the early 2020s and the subsequent economic shifts leading into 2026 show that the gap between these two dates is a high-risk zone. If the stock market experiences a significant correction while your QDRO is sitting on a plan administrator's desk, the person receiving the payout could end up with significantly less than they expected. Conversely, if the market rallies, the person owning the account might feel cheated. This is why professional scriptwriters of these legal documents must include language that accounts for market fluctuations. Without it, you are essentially gambling with your retirement. Another layer of this masterclass involves the often overlooked tax-deferred nature of the 401k. To use a cinematic analogy, a 401k is like a movie that has been filmed but not yet edited or released. You have the raw footage, but you haven't paid the production costs yet. The production cost of a 401k is the future tax bill. If you have $100,000 in a 401k and $100,000 in a standard savings account, they are not equal. The savings account is post-tax money. The 401k is pre-tax money. In 2026, if you are in a 24% tax bracket, that $100,000 401k is actually only worth about $76,000 in spending power. If a divorce settlement treats them as equal, one spouse is getting a significantly better deal. This lack of tax adjustment is a legacy of the early 20th century legal system, which struggled to value intangible assets. It wasn't until the mid-20th century that the U.S. tax code became complex enough that attorneys had to start thinking about the net of tax value of marital property. Today, failing to account for the tax liability of a 401k is one of the most common ways people lose their shirt in a divorce. But there is an even deeper level to this. What happens when the 401k isn't the only retirement asset? What if there is a pension, a Roth IRA, and a series of stock options, all influenced by the same corporate structures that the early Hollywood studios pioneered? The way these different buckets of money interact can create a financial labyrinth that makes even the most complex film plot look simple. And there is one specific type of asset that acts as a poison pill in 401k negotiations, something that can actually cause the entire account to be frozen for years. In the next part, we are going to explore the phenomenon of company stock within a 401k and the specific legal nightmare that occurs when your retirement is tied to the very company you are trying to leave. We will look at how the 1920s concept of industrial loyalty has evolved into a modern trap that can derail your divorce and your future security. The concept of company stock within a 401k is a direct descendant of the industrial loyalty programs of the 1920s, a time when titans of industry like Henry Ford and the heads of the major film studios sought to bind their employees' personal success to the success of the corporation. In early Hollywood, studios like Paramount or MGM didn't just pay a salary, they provided a lifestyle, housing, and social standing, effectively creating a company town atmosphere. The idea was simple. If the studio flourished, the stars flourished. This created a psychological and financial tether that made leaving a studio almost unthinkable for many. Fast forward to 2026, and this same mechanism exists within the 401k, specifically through the inclusion of company stock. When a 401k is heavily weighted with the stock of the employer, it creates a unique legal and financial vulnerability during a divorce. Unlike a diversified mutual fund, company stock is volatile and tied to a single entity. In a divorce scenario, this asset is often the most difficult to divide, because it represents a concentration of risk that both parties may be hesitant to hold. Case studies in 2026 show that when a couple attempts to split a 401k containing significant company stock, they run into the net unrealized appreciation or NUA rule. This is a specific IRS provision that allows for the transfer of company stock from a 401k to a taxable brokerage account, where the growth on that stock is taxed at the lower long-term capital gains rate rather than the higher ordinary income tax rate. Imagine a character named Robert. Robert has worked for a major aerospace firm for 30 years. His 401k is worth $1.2 million, but $600,000 of that is in company stock that he acquired over decades at a very low-cost basis. In his 2026 divorce from his wife, Linda, the decision of how to handle that stock is critical. If they simply use a QDRO to transfer half the account to Linda, she might lose the ability to utilize the NUA strategy. If the stock is sold inside the 401k and then transferred as cash, the potential tax savings on that $600,000 of growth are gone forever. This is the modern version of a star like Buster Keaton losing the rights to his films because of a poorly negotiated studio transition. The asset exists, but the value is trapped behind a wall of technicalities. The legal nightmare intensifies when we consider the concept of restricted stock units or RSUs and unvested shares. In the early US cinema era, a star might be promised a percentage of a film's profits that hadn't even been filmed yet. This was future property. In 2026, many corporate 401ks include matching contributions that vest over a period of 3 to 5 years. If Robert and Linda divorce while half of Robert's company stock is still unvested, the court must decide how much of that future asset belongs to Linda. Does she get a piece of stock that Robert hasn't technically earned yet? Historical trends in family law have led to the implementation of the time rule, or the Deutsch formula. This calculation determines the marital interest in unvested stock by creating a fraction where the numerator is the period of time from the date of the grant to the date of marital separation, and the denominator is the period of time from the date of the grant to the date of vesting. It is a mathematical way of saying that if the labor required to earn that stock happened during the marriage, the stock is a marital asset. But just like a silent film that is half finished when a studio goes bankrupt, unvested stock has no current value, only potential value. If Robert is laid off or leaves the company before the vesting date, that asset disappears for both of them. This brings us to the phenomenon of the frozen account. When a QDRO is filed, the plan administrator often places a hold on the 401k to prevent the participant from taking loans or making significant investment changes that could alter the value before the split is finalized. In 2026, where algorithmic trading and market volatility are the norm, having your primary retirement asset frozen for 6 to 9 months can be catastrophic. Imagine if Robert's company stock begins a sharp decline while the account is frozen. He is forced to watch his net worth evaporate, unable to diversify or sell, because the legal process hasn't cleared. This mirrors the era of the 1930s when stars were blacklisted or put on ice by studios. They couldn't work for anyone else, and they couldn't earn an income, effectively freezing their professional and financial life. In a 401k divorce, the plan administrator acts as the studio head, enforcing the freeze until the legal script is perfect. The risk here is asymmetrical. The spouse who is not the account holder, Linda, in our scenario, is often protected by the QDRO language that specifies a dollar amount, while Robert bears the full brunt of the market's downward movement on his remaining share. To navigate this, we look at historical trends in high-stakes negotiations. Sophisticated attorneys in 2026 are increasingly using what is known as a buyout or an offset. Instead of splitting the 401k and dealing with the QDRO and the freeze, Robert might give Linda a larger share of the equity in their home or a different brokerage account to keep his 401k intact. This is the financial equivalent of a studio buying out a star's contract to avoid a messy public trial. It provides a clean break and immediate liquidity. However, this requires an accurate present value calculation. You cannot simply trade $1 of home equity for $1 of 401k value. As we established in the previous part, the 401k has a hidden tax liability. A $500,000 home is worth more than a $500,000 401k because the home has a primary residence capital gains exclusion, while the 401k is 100% taxable upon withdrawal. If Robert buys out Linda using the face value of the statement, he is overpaying by at least 20 to 30%. This is the same mistake many early film investors made, valuing a studio based on its physical assets like cameras and sets, rather than its intellectual property and future liabilities. Step by step, the 2026 process for handling company stock in a 401k divorce should involve a forensic valuation of the cost basis, an assessment of the NUA potential, and a clear agreement on who bears the risk during the administrative hold period. Without these details, the 401k becomes a poison pill that can destroy the financial stability of both parties. We are seeing a rise in litigation where ex-spouses sue each other years later, because the QDRO didn't specify how to handle stock splits or dividends that occurred during the processing window. The industrial loyalty of the 1920s was designed to create a sense of security, but in the context of a modern divorce, that security is an illusion. The very stock that was meant to fund a golden retirement can become the weight that sinks the ship. We have to look at the 401k not as a static bank account, but as a dynamic living contract that is subject to the whims of the market, the IRS, and the plan administrator. But as complex as company stock is, there is an even more opaque asset that often lurks within the retirement portfolios of the American workforce, the defined benefit pension. While the 401k is the star of the show today, many older workers or those in public sectors still have these traditional pensions. And the way a pension is valued and divided is entirely different from a 401k, involving mathematical formulas that would make an early Hollywood actuary's head spin. In the next part, we are going to dive into the world of the ghost asset, the pension. We will explore the lethal mistakes made when valuing lifelong income streams, and the secret reason why a 401k and a pension are often a recipe for a legal stalemate that lasts a decade. We will see how the 1940s dream of the guaranteed paycheck has become the 2026 nightmare of the infinite valuation. The pension is the ghost of American labor, a lingering specter from the 1940s and 50s, when the major film studios and industrial giants functioned like mini-states, providing cradle-to-grave security. In that era, the concept of a retirement asset was simple. You didn't own a pot of money. You owned a right to a future stream of income. In early U.S. cinema, this was mirrored by the long-term residuals and the pension funds of the Screen Actors Guild, established in the 1930s to protect performers who aged out of their leading man or leading lady status. However, when you fast forward to 2026, the collision between these old-world pensions and the modern 401k creates a valuation nightmare that can paralyze a divorce proceeding for years. To understand the complexity, imagine a character named James. James is a 58-year-old veteran of a major automotive manufacturer. He has a traditional defined benefit pension that will pay him $4,000 a month starting at age 65. He also has a 401k with $300,000 in it. His spouse, Maria, has a 401k worth $600,000 but no pension. At first glance, a lawyer might look at the $900,000 in combined 401k assets and suggest a simple split. But that ignores the ghost in the room, James's pension. What is the value of a $4,000 monthly check that doesn't start for 7 years and lasts until death? In 2026, the process of determining this value is not a simple calculation. It requires an actuary, a professional who uses historical trends, interest rate projections, and mortality tables to determine the present value of that future income. The actuary has to ask, how much cash would James need today to buy an annuity that pays $4,000 a month starting in 7 years? Depending on the interest rates in 2026, that pension could be valued at $500,000 or $800,000. This is the infinite valuation trap. Unlike a 401k, where the number is right there on the screen, a pension's value is a theoretical estimate based on variables that shift every day. This mirrors the early days of the film industry when stars would fight over the valuation of their future royalties. A star might be entitled to 5% of the net profits of a film. But what are net profits? In the world of creative accounting, a film that makes $100 million at the box office can still show a loss on paper. This is precisely how pension valuations feel in a 2026 divorce. If the actuary uses a high discount rate, the present value of the pension looks small, which benefits James. If they use a low discount rate, the value looks massive, which benefits Maria. Case studies from recent years show that these valuations are often the primary cause of legal stalemates. If James's pension is valued at $700,000, and he has a $300,000 401k, his total retirement bundle is worth $1 million. If Maria's 401k is $600,000, James might actually owe Maria money from his 401k to equalize the assets, even though Maria has twice as much cash in her account right now. James is essentially being forced to give up current, liquid cash in exchange for a future promise of income that he might not live long enough to collect. This is a high-stakes gamble that can leave one spouse cash poor, while the other waits for a check that may or may not provide the same standard of living decades from now. Furthermore, we have to address the two main ways a pension is actually divided: the shared interest method and the separate interest method. This is where the 1940s dream truly meets the 2026 legal grind. Under the shared interest method, the pension stays in James's name, and when he starts collecting, the plan administrator cuts two checks, one for James and one for Maria. But here is the catch. If James dies, Maria's payments usually stop unless a survivor benefit was specifically elected and paid for. In early Hollywood, many stars' estates were decimated because they failed to account for these death of the primary clauses in their contracts. The separate interest method is the modern preference, but it is not always available. This method carves out a piece of the pension and turns it into a separate account for the ex-spouse, based on their own life expectancy. If Maria lives to be 100, she keeps getting her check even if James passes away at 70. However, calculating the math for a separate interest QDRO is an administrative labyrinth. Many older pension plans, much like the rigid studio systems of the past, simply do not allow for this. They were built for the nuclear family of 1950, not the complex marital structures of 2026. Historical trends show that as interest rates fluctuate, the tension over these assets increases. In the low interest rate environments we have seen periodically, the present value of a pension skyrockets. This creates a situation where a middle-class worker with a modest pension can suddenly look like a multimillionaire on a divorce balance sheet. Imagine the shock of a teacher or a police officer who is told that their $3,000 a month pension is worth $950,000 in 2026 dollars. It can make an equitable distribution of assets impossible without selling the family home. Step by step, the division of a pension requires 3 distinct stages. First, the discovery of the plan document, the equivalent of finding the original shooting script of a film. You must know what the plan allows. Second, the actuarial valuation, which is the high-level negotiation over the price tag of the future. Third, the drafting of a specialized QDRO that meets the strict requirements of that specific plan. If you miss a single step, or if the actuary uses the wrong mortality table for 2026, the entire financial structure can collapse. We also see a rising trend in 2026 of the Social Security offset. In many states, if one spouse has a pension from a job where they didn't pay into Social Security like some government roles, and the other spouse has a standard 401k and will receive Social Security, the court may attempt to equalize the Social Security benefits as well. Since Social Security is a federal benefit that cannot be divided by a state court, the court has to do a shadow calculation, estimating the value of the Social Security and offsetting it against the pension. It is a hall of mirrors where lawyers and financial experts are trying to balance assets that are fundamentally different in nature. The 1940s dream was a guarantee of peace of mind. The 2026 reality is a calculation of probability. As the 401k became the dominant vehicle, the pension became a specialized, misunderstood asset that often acts as a landmine in divorce negotiations. But there is another layer to this retirement story that is even more modern and even more volatile. While we have been looking at traditional funds and pensions, a new type of asset has entered the 401k space, the self-directed brokerage window and the inclusion of digital assets. What happens when a 401k isn't just stocks and bonds, but includes specialized investments that weren't even legal a decade ago? In the next part, we are going to explore the high-velocity world of self-directed 401ks and the valuation chaos that ensues when a retirement account holds everything from private equity to alternative assets. We will see how the 1950s concept of the safe bet has been replaced by the 2026 reality of the diversified gamble, and why your 401k statement might be hiding a volatility bomb that could reset your divorce negotiations to zero. The rise of the self-directed brokerage window within modern 401k plans marks the end of the era of the passive observer, much like the transition in early U.S. cinema from the fixed-camera stage plays of the 1900s to the dynamic, multi-angle spectacles of the 1950s. In the early days of film, the audience saw only what the director allowed in a single wide shot. Similarly, for decades, a 401k participant saw only a small menu of 5 or 10 mutual funds pre-selected by their employer. But by 2026, the industrial landscape has shifted. Many large-scale U.S. employers now offer a brokerage window, often called a PCRA or Personal Choice Retirement Account, which allows an employee to buy almost any individual stock, exchange-traded fund, or alternative asset within their tax-advantaged retirement shell. This shift has profound implications for a divorce. When a 401k was just a collection of target date funds, valuation was a straight line. In 2026, a 401k might be a chaotic masterpiece of individual stock picks, leveraged ETFs, and even exposure to private equity or real estate investment trusts. Imagine a character named Thomas. Thomas works for a high-tech manufacturing firm and has used his 401k brokerage window to aggressively trade high-volatility semiconductor stocks and energy futures. His account balance at the start of the divorce was $450,000. 6 months later, due to a sector-specific downturn, the balance is $280,000. In a traditional 401k divorce, the court might look at the date of separation as the line in the sand for valuation. If Thomas and his spouse, Karen, separated when the account was at $450,000, Karen's legal team will argue that she is entitled to half of that peak value. Thomas, however, is left holding an account that has lost nearly 40% of its paper wealth. This is the volatility bomb. Because Thomas was the director of his own portfolio, actively making trades through the brokerage window, Karen may argue that he committed waste of marital assets by engaging in risky trading while the divorce was pending. Historical trends show that courts in 2026 are increasingly forced to act as film critics of a spouse's investment strategy. Was the drop in value a result of general market trends, which both spouses should share? Or was it a result of a specific high-risk gamble made by one individual? If the court finds that the account holder acted recklessly, they might credit the non-employee spouse with their share of the higher valuation, leaving the account holder with a much smaller remaining balance. This is a far cry from the 1920s concept of the company man whose retirement was a steady, predictable accumulation of corporate loyalty. Case studies involving self-directed 401ks often highlight the issue of embedded tax liabilities in individual stock positions. If Thomas's 401k is filled with individual stocks that have massive unrealized gains, the future tax bill is a silent partner in that account. However, if he has been day trading and realizing those gains within the 401k, the tax is deferred, but the cost basis is reset. Dividing this is a forensic nightmare. Lawyers in 2026 must now demand a full trading history, not just a balance statement. They need to see every transaction made through that brokerage window to ensure one spouse isn't hiding or manipulating the value through complex option strategies. This mirrors the shift in the 1940s when movie studios began to transition from owning everything outright to complex financing deals involving independent producers. Suddenly, the value of a movie wasn't just the film in the canister. It was the web of contracts, distribution rights, and overhead allocations. In a 2026 divorce, a 401k with a brokerage window is that complex web. If the QDRO is not written with extreme specificity regarding which securities are to be transferred in kind versus which are to be liquidated for cash, the resulting tax and commission costs can be devastating. Step by step, the 2026 approach to a self-directed 401k divorce requires a three-phase audit. First, you must identify if a brokerage window exists. Many people don't even realize their spouse has this option. Second, you must secure a freeze on the trading activity. In the age of mobile apps and 24-hour trading, a spouse could theoretically liquidate a portfolio and move into cash or highly stable assets in a matter of seconds, potentially locking in a loss for the other party. Third, the legal team must decide on an in-kind transfer. This means instead of selling everything and giving the ex-spouse cash, you move the actual shares of stock or ETFs into a new account for them. This preserves the potential for future recovery if the market is down. Imagine if, in the 1950s, a studio had to divide its film library. If they sold the films for cash during a box office slump, they would lose the future value of those assets. Instead, they often divided the rights. A 2026 QDRO for a self-directed 401k should do the same. It should specify that Karen gets 50% of each individual holding in Thomas's brokerage window. If Thomas owns 100 shares of a tech giant, Karen gets 50. This ensures that both parties are on the same side of the market's volatility. But there is a new, even more complex wrinkle in the 2026 retirement landscape: the emergence of digital assets and cryptocurrency exposure within institutional 401k platforms. Following historical trends where the Department of Labor issued warnings about these assets, many providers now allow a small percentage of a 401k to be allocated to digital asset accounts. This is the modern equivalent of the early cinema transition to color and widescreen, an exciting but technically difficult advancement that the existing legal framework was never designed to handle. If a 401k contains a digital asset sleeve, the valuation can change by 10% in the time it takes a lawyer to type a single paragraph of a settlement agreement. These assets don't follow the 9:30 a.m. to 4 p.m. trading hours of the New York Stock Exchange. They are live 24/7. This creates a synchronization problem for the court. If the judgment is signed on a Friday, but the plan administrator doesn't process the split until the following Tuesday, the value could be unrecognizable. We are seeing 2026 case studies where litigants are fighting over a few hours of market movement. This leads to the necessity of using a valuation floor or a valuation ceiling in the QDRO language. For example, the document might state that the spouse receives $100,000, but in no event more than 50% of the total account value at the time of transfer. This protects the plan administrator from being ordered to pay out more money than actually exists in the account. The 1920s dream of industrial stability has been fully replaced by the 2026 reality of high-frequency finance. The 401k is no longer a boring bucket of bonds. It is a sophisticated, high-stakes engine of wealth that requires constant navigation. As we have seen, the more control an individual has over their retirement funds, the more legal liability they face when those funds are scrutinized in a divorce. But as difficult as it is to value stocks and digital assets, there is a final category of retirement wealth that is almost entirely invisible to the naked eye. It is the world of executive perks, top hat plans, and non-qualified deferred compensation. These are the assets reserved for the modern-day equivalents of the studio moguls. They don't follow the rules of ERISA, they aren't subject to QDROs, and in a divorce, they can be used as a secret weapon to hide millions of dollars in plain sight. In the next part, we are going to dive into the world of the shadow 401k. We will look at how the top tier of American earners uses non-qualified plans to bypass the standard rules of asset division, and the specific forensic techniques required to unmask these hidden millions. We will see how the 1930s practice of off-book accounting has evolved into a sophisticated corporate strategy that can leave an unsuspecting spouse with nothing but the crumbs of a 401k. The world of non-qualified deferred compensation, often referred to as top hat plans, is the modern financial equivalent of the secret backlot deals that defined the 1930s studio era. In those days, the public saw the massive salaries of stars like Clark Gable or Greta Garbo, but the real power lay in the side letters, private agreements that provided for lifetime travel expenses, hidden production bonuses, and off-book percentages of the international distribution rights. These were assets that didn't appear on the standard payroll. In 2026, the American executive class uses non-qualified plans to mirror this exact dynamic, creating a shadow retirement system that operates entirely outside the protections of ERISA and the visibility of the standard 401k statement. To understand why this is a lethal trap in a divorce, we must first look at the mechanical difference between a 401k and a non-qualified deferred compensation plan, or NQDC. A 401k is a trust. The money is held in your name, and even if your company goes bankrupt, that money is yours. An NQDC, however, is essentially an unsecured promise from the employer. The executive agrees to defer a portion of their salary or bonus, and the company promises to pay it out at a later date, usually retirement. Because these plans are non-qualified, they are not subject to the same contribution limits as a 401k. While a 401k might be capped at $23,000 a year in employee contributions, an NQDC can hold millions of dollars in deferred bonuses. Imagine a character named Christopher. Christopher is a senior vice president at a major media conglomerate in 2026. His standard 401k shows a healthy balance of $600,000. During his divorce from his wife, Sarah, Christopher's legal team presents this 401k as his primary retirement asset. However, buried deep within his executive employment contract is an NQDC plan where he has been deferring 50% of his performance bonuses for the last decade. That hidden account holds $3.5 million. Because this isn't a qualified plan, it doesn't show up on a standard benefits summary, and it cannot be divided by a QDRO. This is where the forensic audit becomes the hero of the story. In early U.S. cinema, forensic accounting was used to bust the monopolies of the studio system. In 2026, it is used to find the deferred compensation. A standard QDRO, which we have discussed extensively, has no power over an NQDC. If Sarah's lawyer isn't aware of the top hat plan, Christopher could walk away with 85% of his total retirement wealth intact, while Sarah believes she has received an equitable 50% split of the 401k. The historical trend of these plans shows they were designed to bypass the egalitarian rules of the 1974 ERISA Act. The government wanted to ensure that if a company provided a retirement plan for the CEO, they also had to provide it for the janitor. The top hat plan was the loophole. As long as the plan is limited to a select group of management or highly compensated employees, the company can do whatever it wants. In a divorce, this means the plan is governed by contract law, not federal retirement law. If Sarah discovers the $3.5 million, she faces a second hurdle: the risk of forfeiture. In early Hollywood, a studio could cancel a star's future payments if they violated a morality clause. Similarly, many NQDC plans have a bad actor or non-compete clause. If Christopher leaves the company to work for a rival, or if the company goes into debt, that $3.5 million can vanish. The money is technically a general asset of the corporation. If the company files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, Christopher becomes just another unsecured creditor, standing in line behind the bondholders. How do you value an asset that is both massive and potentially worth zero? This is the central conflict of the 2026 executive divorce. If Sarah demands $1.75 million as her share of the NQDC, and the court orders Christopher to pay her from other assets, Christopher is taking a massive risk. He is giving Sarah hard cash today in exchange for a promise of future money from a company that might not exist in 10 years. Conversely, if Sarah agrees to wait and take her share when Christopher retires, she is tethered to his career choices and the company's solvency. Step by step, the division of a shadow 401k requires a process called a constructive trust or a sidecar agreement. Since the plan administrator will not accept a QDRO, the court must order Christopher to pay Sarah directly as he receives his distributions. This creates a decade-long financial entanglement that mirrors the messy studio divorces of the 1940s, where ex-spouses remained business partners in film rights long after the marriage ended. Case studies from 2026 illustrate the danger of the tax cliff in these plans. Unlike a 401k, which can be rolled over into an IRA to continue the tax deferral, NQDC distributions are often paid out in a lump sum or a fixed schedule of 5 to 10 years. These payments are taxed as ordinary income at the highest marginal rates. If Christopher receives a $500,000 payout from his NQDC, he might only see $260,000 after federal, state, and local taxes. If the divorce decree says Sarah gets $250,000, Christopher is left with almost nothing. The failure to specify that the division should be net of taxes is the most common professional error in high net worth 401k-related litigation. Historical trends also show the rise of supplemental executive retirement plans, or SERPs. These are the modern version of the lifetime studio contracts given to the most elite directors and producers. A SERP provides a retirement benefit that is often calculated as a percentage of the executive's final average pay. This is a ghost asset that doesn't even have an account balance. It is a formula. Finding a SERP requires a line-by-line review of SEC filings, specifically the proxy statement or Form 10-K for public companies. If you are divorcing an executive at a public U.S. firm in 2026, the answers to your financial future are often hidden in the fine print of federal filings that the executive hoped you would never read. The level of secrecy in these plans is a direct legacy of the 1930s, where keeping the star's true earnings hidden was essential to maintaining the studio's leverage. Today, that leverage is used against the spouse. We have seen instances where companies create specialized, one-off retirement agreements for top talent that are so confidential even the HR department doesn't have the full details. Only the board of directors and the legal department know they exist. As we move toward the final stages of this masterclass, we have to recognize that the 401k is just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface lies a complex world of non-qualified promises, deferred bonuses, and contractual ghosts. But even if you find all the money, and even if you draft the perfect QDRO or constructive trust, there is one final boss in the world of 401k divorce. It is the human element, the specific aggressive tactics used to devalue these accounts during the peak of the litigation. What happens when a spouse deliberately changes their investment strategy to tank the account value? What happens when they take out maximum loans to drain the equity before the freeze is in place? In the next part, we are going to explore the world of retirement asset dissipation. We will look at the psychological warfare of the 401k divorce and the legal remedies available to stop a spouse from burning down the house to save the ashes. We will see how the 1920s concept of scorched earth litigation has been adapted for the 2026 digital economy, and the specific ways you can protect your share of the dream. The scorched earth policy of the 1920s was a tactic popularized by the early Hollywood moguls who would rather bankrupt a studio or destroy a star's reputation than lose a contractual dispute. They understood that if you control the resources, you control the outcome. In 2026, this same psychological warfare has migrated into the digital realm of retirement accounts. We are seeing a rise in what forensic accountants call retirement asset dissipation. This is the intentional devaluing, draining, or complicating of a 401k or similar account during the pendency of a divorce to reduce the amount available for the other spouse. It is the financial equivalent of a director burning the only existing negative of a film to ensure no one else can ever screen it. To understand the mechanics of this in 2026, imagine a character named Michael. Michael is a high-level consultant who knows his marriage to his wife, Jennifer, is ending. Before the divorce papers are even served, Michael begins a series of subtle but devastating financial maneuvers. First, he takes out a $50,000 loan against his 401k. Under current U.S. law, most plans allow you to borrow up to 50% of your vested balance or $50,000, whichever is less. Michael uses this cash for living expenses that are difficult to track, effectively removing $50,000 of marital equity from the retirement pot. Next, Michael goes into his 401k's self-directed brokerage window and shifts his entire portfolio from stable index funds into highly speculative, 3 times leveraged inverse ETFs. If the market goes up, his account value craters. If the market goes down, he might make a profit, but the goal here is the gamble. If he loses $100,000 in a matter of weeks, he can claim in court that it was simply a bad investment during a volatile year. Jennifer is then left to fight over half of a much smaller pie. Historical trends in U.S. family law have had to evolve rapidly to catch up with these digital age tactics. In the early 20th century, dissipation usually involved spending cash on a third party or gambling at a physical casino. In 2026, dissipation happens via a smartphone app at 2 a.m. For Jennifer to protect herself, she needs to understand the concept of the Automatic Temporary Restraining Order, or ATRO. In many U.S. states, the moment a divorce is filed and served, an automatic injunction goes into place that prohibits both parties from transferring, encumbering, or concealing assets. If Michael takes that loan or makes those risky trades after the ATRO is in effect, he is in contempt of court. However, the burden of proof is on Jennifer. She must provide a step-by-step forensic trail showing that Michael's actions were not part of a long-term investment strategy, but were specifically designed to deplete the marital estate. This is where the 1920s concept of waste becomes a 2026 legal reality. If a court finds that a spouse has committed marital waste, they can add back the dissipated funds to that spouse's side of the ledger. If Michael lost $100,000 through reckless trading after the separation, the court may act as if that $100,000 still exists and subtract it from Michael's remaining share of the other assets, like the house or the savings accounts. Case studies from 2026 illustrate a particularly aggressive tactic known as the tax trigger trap. In this scenario, a spouse deliberately triggers a non-qualified distribution from a retirement account, knowing that it will incur a 10% penalty and immediate income tax. They then use the remaining cash to pay off their own separate debts or hide it in difficult-to-track digital wallets. By the time the other spouse realizes what has happened, the retirement asset is gone, replaced by a massive tax liability that is technically a marital debt. The historical trend here is a shift from hiding the money to destroying the money, so that neither party can fully benefit from it, out of pure spite. This mirrors the high-stakes drama of the 1930s when stars would intentionally perform poorly or go on strike to tank the value of their contract, forcing the studio to settle on the star's terms. In a 2026 401k divorce, the spouse who holds the account has the key to the vault, and if they feel they are losing the legal battle, they may choose to melt the vault. To prevent this, the non-account holding spouse must move with the speed of a modern news cycle. Step 1 is the immediate request for a joinder. This is a legal process where the retirement plan itself is joined as a party to the divorce. Once the 401k plan administrator is formally joined, they are legally put on notice that the ownership of the funds is in dispute. This often triggers an administrative hold that is much stronger than a simple court order between two individuals. It stops loans, it stops distributions, and in many cases it can even limit the ability to make drastic changes to the investment allocations. In early cinema, the production code was established to bring order to the chaos of the industry. In 2026, the joinder and the ATRO are the production codes of the divorce world. They create a set of rules that, if followed, ensure the assets remain intact until the final edit of the divorce decree is signed. But even with these protections, there is a psychological toll. The 401k is often seen as the survival fund for the spouse who worked decades to build it. They may feel a deep primal urge to protect it, leading them to justify these scorched earth tactics as self-defense. On the other side, the non-working spouse may see the 401k as their only ticket to a future without poverty. When these two high-stakes emotions collide, the 401k becomes more than just a financial account. It becomes a proxy for every resentment and hurt that occurred during the marriage. As we look at historical trends leading into 2026, we see that the most successful resolutions in these cases are those that remove the emotion from the math. This involves using a third-party neutral, such as a QDRO consultant or a specialized financial mediator. These professionals act like the independent producers of the 1950s. They don't care about the drama on the set. They only care about getting the project finished and ensuring the distribution is legally sound. We must also consider the impact of Social Security credits as a hidden factor in this warfare. In the US, if you were married for at least 10 years, you may be entitled to receive Social Security benefits based on your ex-spouse's earnings record. This doesn't take anything away from the earner's benefit, but many people don't know this. A common scorched earth tactic is to rush a divorce to finish in 9 years and 11 months, specifically to cut off the other spouse from this federal benefit. This is the financial equivalent of a studio firing a star just days before their pension vests. The complexity of these maneuvers in 2026 requires a level of vigilance that most people aren't prepared for. You aren't just getting a divorce. You are navigating a multi-front financial war that involves the IRS, federal labor laws, and the technical limitations of 1980s-era mainframe computers used by plan administrators. But what if the danger isn't coming from your spouse's aggression? What if the biggest threat to your 401k is actually the default settings of the law itself? As we approach the final stages of this deep dive, we are going to look at the silent killers of retirement wealth: inflation, the widow's tax in divorce, and the catastrophic mistake people make when they finally receive their share of the money. In the next part, we will explore the aftermath, the specific reasons why 50% of a 401k in a divorce settlement often turns into only 30% of actual spending power by the time you reach retirement. We will see how the 1920s dream of the end was just the beginning of a whole new set of challenges, and how to avoid the sequel that no one wants to star in. The aftermath of a 401k division is rarely as simple as the final frame of a silent movie where the couple rides into the sunset. In the world of 2026 finance, the word split is a deceptive term. When a judge signs a decree stating that a retirement account shall be divided 50-50, most people imagine two equal piles of gold. However, historical trends in the United States demonstrate that the person receiving the transfer often ends up with significantly less actual purchasing power due to the silent killers of the settlement: inflation, transaction timing, and the phenomenon known as the survivor benefit trap. To understand this, we have to look back at how the early film industry handled the transition from silent films to talkies. Many stars thought they had 50% of the rights to their work, only to find that the technical costs of converting those films to sound ate up the entirety of their equity. In 2026, the technical costs of your 401k transfer are the hidden market gaps and the tax treatment of the specific funds you receive. Imagine a character named Emily. Emily has just finalized her divorce from her husband, Jason. The court awarded her $250,000 from Jason's 401k. The QDRO was drafted and approved by the plan administrator. However, between the time the judge signed the order and the time the funds were actually moved into Emily's new rollover IRA, 6 weeks elapsed. During those 6 weeks, the market experienced a sharp 5% recovery. Because Emily's QDRO specified a flat dollar amount of $250,000 rather than a percentage of the account, Emily missed out on $12,500 of market growth. Jason, conversely, kept all the growth on the entire account during that processing window. This is a common historical trend where the recipient of a fixed-sum QDRO effectively loses money the longer the paperwork takes to process. Step by step, the destruction of purchasing power in a 401k divorce follows a predictable path. First, there is the immediate impact of the liquidation. If the plan administrator has to sell individual stocks or mutual funds to create the cash for the transfer, they are doing so at the current market price, which might be a local low. Second, there is the time out of the market. While the funds are being moved from the 401k to the IRA, that money is often sitting in a cash equivalent settlement fund. If the market moves up during this time, the spouse receiving the money is falling behind. This is the financial equivalent of an early Hollywood studio holding a film in a vault for 2 years before release. The cultural moment passes, and the value is diminished. We must also analyze the widow's tax equivalent in divorce. In the early 20th century, if a film star died without a clear beneficiary clause, the studio often reclaimed the rights to their images and likenesses. In a modern 401k context, if Emily receives her share of the 401k but fails to update her own beneficiary designations immediately, and then something happens to her, the money might actually revert to Jason depending on the specific language of the plan and state law. This is a catastrophic oversight that occurs in thousands of cases every year. The 401k is a contract with a third-party administrator, and that contract often overrides the instructions in a will. Furthermore, we have to address the impact of inflation in 2026. If you are 45 years old and you receive $200,000 in a divorce settlement, that number sounds substantial. But based on historical trends of a 3% average inflation rate, that $200,000 will only have the purchasing power of about $110,000 by the time you are 65. In early US cinema, the price of a movie ticket was 5 cents. By the time the stars of those films retired, the cost of living had tripled. If your divorce settlement doesn't account for the fact that $401,000 are future dollars that must be invested aggressively to maintain their value, you are essentially winning a battle, but losing the war for your survival. Case studies in 2026 show that the most successful individuals in a 401k divorce are those who treat the settlement not as a windfall, but as a seed. Imagine if Emily, instead of just letting the money sit in a standard target date fund, worked with a financial professional to reallocate those funds into a diversified portfolio that accounts for her specific life expectancy and risk tolerance, which may be entirely different from her ex-husband's. Jason might have a high risk tolerance because he still has 20 years of high earning potential. Emily, if she has been out of the workforce, has a much lower tolerance for volatility. Splitting the account 50-50 but keeping the same investment strategy is a recipe for disaster. There is also the issue of the 72T distribution. Under Section 72T of the Internal Revenue Code, there are specific ways to take early distributions from a 401k or IRA without the 10% penalty, provided you take substantially equal periodic payments. This is a tool often used by divorcees who need immediate cash flow, but don't want to decimate their retirement base. However, the rules are incredibly rigid. If you miss a single payment or change the amount, the IRS can retroactively apply the 10% penalty to every dollar you've already taken. It is the legal equivalent of a star trying to break a studio contract early. If you don't follow the exact procedure, the penalties will follow you for years. In the early days of cinema, when the transition to sound happened, many actors found their voices didn't match their personas. Their career died because the medium changed. In a 401k divorce, the medium is the tax code. If you receive a large portion of a 401k but you are in a higher tax bracket than your spouse was, you are actually receiving less value per dollar. For example, if Jason was in the 12% bracket and Emily, after the divorce and returning to work, is in the 24% bracket, every dollar she takes out of that 401k is taxed at twice the rate it would have been for Jason. This is why sophisticated settlements in 2026 use a tax adjustment calculation to ensure true equity. But as we look at the wreckage of the 401k division and the challenges of the aftermath, there is one final, overarching question that haunts every person going through this process. It is the question that the early pioneers of cinema had to answer when they reached the end of their careers and looked back at the empires they built. Was it worth the cost? And more importantly, how do you rebuild a sense of security when the foundation you relied on for 20 or 30 years has been fractured? We have explored the history, the law, the forensic traps, and the administrative nightmares. We have seen how the glitz of the silver screen is inextricably linked to the fine print of the Revenue Act. But we haven't yet discussed the final transformation. What happens to the person who comes out the other side? There is a strategy for the final act that goes beyond just math and law. It involves a fundamental shift in how you view wealth and independence in the modern American economy. In the final part of this masterclass, we are going to pull all these threads together. We are going to look at the legacy strategy. The exact steps to take in the first 90 days after your 401k is divided to ensure the sequel to your life is more prosperous than the original. We will look at the rise of the single-person pension and the secret way to turn your 401k settlement into a fortress that no future legal or economic storm can touch. The story of early US cinema ended with the rise of the independent artist. Your story can end with the rise of the independent, secure individual. But first, you have to survive the most dangerous transition of all, the moment the money actually hits your account. In the final part, we reveal why that moment is the greatest risk of all. The moment the funds from a 401k settlement actually hit your account is the most dangerous transition in the entire divorce process. In the world of 2026 finance, this is the point of no return, the final scene where the credits roll, and you are left alone with the results of your production. In early US cinema, this was the era of the Paramount Decree of 1948, a monumental legal divorcement, where the Supreme Court forced movie studios to sell off their theaters. The studios thought they were finally free, but the sudden lack of a guaranteed distribution network nearly bankrupted the industry. They had the films, but they no longer had the system to turn those films into survival. When you receive your 401k transfer in 2026, you are essentially in the position of those post-1948 studios. You have the assets, but you've lost the institutional distribution system of the marital household. Historical trends show that the alternate payee, the spouse receiving the money, often makes one of three catastrophic errors in the first 90 days that can lead to a 30% to 40% loss of their new wealth before they even finish the first year of independence. The first mistake is the cash-out trap. In a standard 401k withdrawal, you are hit with a 10% early withdrawal penalty if you are under age 59.5, plus immediate income tax. However, a little-known provision in the tax code allows an alternate payee to take a cash distribution directly from the participant's 401k as part of a QDRO, without paying that 10% penalty. This sounds like a win, and for many in 2026 who are facing mounting legal fees or the need for a new home down payment, it is an incredibly tempting escape hatch. Plus one. Imagine a character named Julia. Julia receives $200,000 from her ex-husband's 401k. She needs cash for a fresh start, so she opts to take the full amount as a check, rather than rolling it over into an IRA. Because it's a QDRO distribution, she avoids the $20,000 penalty. However, she does not avoid the income tax. The plan administrator is legally required to withhold 20% for federal taxes immediately, meaning the check she receives is only for $160,000. But it gets worse. In 2026, that $200,000 is added to her other income for the year, potentially pushing her into a 32% or 35% tax bracket. By the time she files her taxes next April, she may owe an additional $30,000 or more. Julia has effectively turned $200,000 of retirement security into roughly $130,000 of liquid cash. She has repeated the mistake of early silent film stars who sold their future royalties for a quick payout to fund a lavish lifestyle, only to find themselves penniless when the industry shifted. Plus two. The second mistake is the frozen asset syndrome. Even if you choose a direct rollover to an IRA, the way you move that money matters. If the transfer is done as an indirect rollover, where the check is made out to you and you have 60 days to deposit it, the 20% tax withholding still applies. You then have to find the money from other sources to make up that 20% difference when you deposit it into your new IRA, or the IRS treats that missing 20% as a taxable distribution. In 2026, the only safe path is the trustee-to-trustee transfer, where the money moves directly between institutions. This is the financial equivalent of a seamless edit in a film. Nothing is lost in the transition. The third mistake, and perhaps the most subtle, is the reinvestment lag. Historical trends in 2026 show that many people, overwhelmed by the emotional toll of the divorce, leave their transferred funds in a default cash or money market account within their new IRA for months or even years. While they are waiting for the right time to invest, inflation is eating away at their purchasing power. Case studies show that a person who delays reinvesting their settlement by just 12 months during a market recovery can lose out on tens of thousands of dollars in compound growth. To build your legacy strategy, you must treat the first 90 days like the post-production phase of a blockbuster film. You need a step-by-step checklist to ensure the foundation is secure. Step 1. The beneficiary audit. The day the money lands in your new IRA, you must name your new beneficiaries. In the eyes of the law, your divorce decree does not automatically update your 401k or IRA. If you die without updating these forms, the money could go back to your ex-spouse regardless of what your will says. Step 2. The tax liability calculation. Before you spend a single dollar of a cash distribution, set aside the maximum potential tax in a separate high-yield savings account. Treat it as if it's already gone. Step 3. The risk tolerance reset. Your investment strategy as a single person in 2026 must be different from your strategy as a married person. You no longer have a second income safety net. You need to reevaluate your portfolio to ensure it matches your specific timeline for retirement, which may have shifted due to the divorce. The pioneers of early U.S. cinema who survived the divorcement of the studios were those who realized that they weren't just actors or directors anymore. They were independent entities. They began to produce their own work, own their own negatives, and control their own distribution. This is your path forward. Your 401k settlement is your independent studio. It is the seed money for a life where you are the sole executive producer. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, remember that the history of American wealth is a history of transitions. From the silent flicker of the 1920s to the algorithmic 401k trades of 2026, the rules of the game have always favored those who understand the fine print. You have navigated the QDRO labyrinth, unmasked the shadow accounts, and survived the scorched earth of litigation. You have the assets. Now, you must have the discipline to protect them. But there is one final piece of the puzzle. While the 401k is the largest paper asset, there is another living asset that often determines the true quality of life in retirement. It is the hidden connection between your physical health and your financial longevity, a concept the early stars of Hollywood ignored until it was too late. In our next series, we will explore the longevity tax and the secret strategies used by the elite to ensure their money outlives their needs. The credits are rolling on your divorce, but the sequel, your independent future, is just beginning. Are you ready to take the lead?